This story is titled Living in Her Shadow. My name is Clara, and I'm 48 years old. I live in a small, charming house in Vermont where the winters are long and the summers feel like a reward. I've always been someone who sees beauty in the little things, watching the snow fall outside my window, hearing the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, or sitting by the fire with a good book. I met my husband James 5 years ago. He's 54, a widower, and the kindest man I've ever known. When we first met, I felt like I had stumbled upon something rare, a second chance at love. James has a way of making you feel safe, like nothing in the world could hurt you as long as he's by your side. But James also carries a weight that I've never been able to lift. Her name was Margaret, and she was his first wife. From the very beginning, Margaret's presence loomed over our relationship. I understood why. She was the love of his life, his partner for over 20 years before she passed away. When James spoke about her, his voice would soften and his eyes would light up, as if she were still there, sitting beside him. At first, I didn't mind. I even found it endearing. After all, it's a sign of a good heart to cherish someone you've lost. I wanted to be patient, to honor his grief, while also building a life together. But over time, things began to shift. It started with little comments. Small, seemingly harmless comparisons that pricked at my confidence. Margaret always loved this song, he'd say as we drove in the car. Or Margaret would have laughed at that joke during a dinner party. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it wasn't a big deal. But the comparisons didn't stop. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, James stood in the doorway, watching me chop vegetables. "Margaret used to cut them just like that," he said with a fond smile. I froze for a moment, the knife hovering in my hand. I forced a smile and said, "Well, I guess great minds think alike." But inside, I felt small, invisible. As the months turned into years, I realized that I wasn't just married to James. I was sharing my life with a ghost. Margaret was everywhere, in the pictures that still hung on the walls, in the stories he told, even in the way he talked about the future. One day, I finally worked up the courage to bring it up. We were sitting on the couch, the fire crackling in the hearth, when I turned to him and said, "James, can I ask you something?" "Of course," he said, looking up from his book. "Do you ever feel like you compare me to Margaret?" He frowned, his brows knitting together. "Compare you? What do you mean?" I hesitated, unsure how to put it into words. "It's just, sometimes it feels like I'm living in her shadow, like no matter what I do, I'll never be her." His face softened, but I could see the hurt in his eyes. "Clara, that's not true," he said, reaching for my hand. "You're you, and that's why I love you." "But you talk about her all the time," I said quietly. "And I understand why. You loved her and she was a huge part of your life. But sometimes it feels like there's no room for me." James was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Clara," he said, "I never meant to make you feel that way. Margaret was a part of my past, yes, but you're my present. You're my future. And if I've made you feel less than that, I'm sorry." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to feel the weight of his words and let them heal the cracks in my heart. But part of me couldn't help wondering, was it really possible to move forward when so much of his heart was still rooted in the past? The weeks that followed were a roller coaster of emotions. James made an effort to reassure me, to focus on our life together rather than his memories of Margaret. But the comparisons didn't stop entirely. They were fewer, yes, but they still slipped out in quiet moments, like uninvited guests at a dinner party. One evening, as we were unpacking boxes in the attic, I found an old photo album. It was filled with pictures of James and Margaret, laughing, traveling, celebrating holidays. "Do you want to look through it?" James asked, his tone hesitant. I nodded, unsure of what else to say. As we flipped through the pages, I felt a mixture of emotions. Jealousy, sadness, even a strange sense of gratitude. Margaret had clearly been a wonderful person, and she had brought James so much happiness. But as I looked at those pictures, I couldn't shake the feeling that I would always be second best. A consolation prize in a race I never even signed up for. At night, as I lay awake in bed, I realized something important. I couldn't change the past. I couldn't erase Margaret's place in James's heart, and I wouldn't want to. But I also couldn't keep living in her shadow. I needed to find a way to communicate my feelings without making James feel like he had to choose between us. And I needed to decide if I was willing to fight for a future where I could finally feel seen, loved, and valued for who I am. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring out the window at the snow-covered backyard. James was still asleep, and the house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. My mind was racing. I had spent the entire night replaying every conversation, every comparison, every moment that had chipped away at my confidence. But instead of feeling defeated, I felt a spark of determination. This was my life too, my marriage. And if I wanted it to work, I needed to fight for it, not by tearing Margaret's memory down, but by building myself up. When James came downstairs, I asked him to join me at the table. He looked surprised, but sat down, his expression wary. "James," I began, my voice steady but firm, "I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I need to say some things. I love you, and I know you love me, but I also feel like we've been carrying something between us that we need to address." He nodded slowly. "I'm listening." "I need to feel like I'm enough for you," I said, the words pouring out of me like a dam had broken. "I need to know that our life together is just as important to you as your memories of Margaret, because right now it feels like I'm competing with her, and that's not fair to either of us." James looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and guilt. "Clara," he said, his voice heavy, "you are enough. I don't want you to feel like you're in competition with Margaret, but I guess I haven't done a good job of showing you that." I reached across the table and took his hand. "It's not just about words, James, it's about actions. I want us to create our own memories, our own traditions. I don't want to erase Margaret from your life, but I do want to feel like I'm building something with you, not just living in the shadow of what you had before." He nodded, squeezing my hand. "You're right," he said. "I've been holding on to the past because it felt safe, familiar. But I don't want to lose you, Clara. You're my present, my future, and I'll do whatever it takes to make you feel that way." Over the next few weeks, James made a concerted effort to focus on our relationship. He suggested we take a trip together. Just the two of us. No distractions, no reminders of the past. We chose a cabin in the mountains, far from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. It was the perfect place to reconnect, to remind ourselves of why we fell in love in the first place. During one of our hikes, as we stood at the edge of a breathtaking overlook, James turned to me and said something that I'll never forget. "Clara," he said, his voice steady, "you've taught me that it's okay to let go of the past, to cherish it without letting it define me. And I want you to know that I'm here, with you, 100%. I'm not perfect and I'll probably make mistakes, but I'm committed to building a life with you." Tears filled my eyes as I took his hand. "That's all I've ever wanted," I said. The trip marked a turning point for us. When we returned home, James took down some of the pictures of Margaret that had lined the walls. He didn't get rid of them. They were still a part of his story. But he made room for new memories, new photographs of us together. We also started going to couples therapy, something I had suggested but hadn't been sure he'd agree to. It was hard at first, sitting in that room, confronting our issues head on. But it was also healing. We learned how to communicate better, how to express our needs without placing blame. One evening after a particularly emotional session, James surprised me by pulling out a small box. "I've been holding on to this for a while," he said, handing it to me. I opened the box to find a delicate necklace with a charm shaped like a snowflake. "It reminded me of you," he said, his voice soft. "Unique, beautiful, and strong enough to withstand anything." I was speechless, overwhelmed by the gesture. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly seen, truly loved. Our journey wasn't perfect. No relationship ever is. There were still moments when I felt the sting of comparison. Still times when Margaret's memory felt like a third presence in our marriage. But what mattered most was that James and I were willing to do the work, to fight for each other, to create a life that was ours and ours alone. Because love isn't about erasing the past. It's about honoring it while building a future, together. If this story resonates with you, please like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for listening.